hey, we'll carry on because life throws things at us sometimes, and we just have to deal with it. And that's kind of where we are with Elijah. In chapter 18 of 1 Kings, we see Elijah at his very boldest. He's challenging the most powerful couple in the land. He's praying down fire from heaven. Makes a great sermon. And it's something to get really excited about. He's had years of drought, and he's outrun the king's chariot in the strength of God. But in chapter 19, we find him under a bush in the wilderness, praying that he might die. It's a bit of a difference there between the two. Have you ever had moments in life like that, then, when life just threatens to overwhelm you? Moments when you've given everything that you had to accomplish something, some great achievement, and afterwards you just feel empty. Maybe moments when after a victory you slip into discouragement. Moments when you've been strong in your faith, when someone says the wrong thing and you're suddenly overwhelmed by fear or loneliness or despair. And when we walk into church on a Sunday morning and someone asks, how are you? What do we say? I'm fine. I'm okay. Always fine. It's almost like we fought an epidemic with fine-itis on the church. We wear the mask of fine because it feels safer than admitting that we're tired or we're discouraged or we're afraid. But Elijah's story reminds us that prophets, human prophets, were always tired. Elijah may be one of the most revered prophets in the Bible, but James 5 verse 17, which I think the bottom of the next slide, reminds us that Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. Someone might be a man like Elijah, pouring down fire out of heaven, breathing him out to life. He's fed by, so maybe I don't want to be fed by rays, not ravens, but he lived thousands of years ago, but he was still human. And human nature hasn't changed in that time. This is what happens when we come to the end of ourselves. But as we'll see, this story tells something vital. When we reach that point, we have God who meets us right where we are. Practically, emotionally, and spiritually. So why was Elijah afraid and fled his life? Sounds like a huge contrast. He's defeated Jezebel's prophets. He's demonstrated the power of God. He's fulfilled his promise and prophecy about the drought. You might think that he's proved his point. I do think it's interesting here that King Ahab tells Jezebel everything that Elijah has done. He doesn't tell her that everything that God has done. The blame is firmly on the human responsible, because you'd have to expect that God did do something, which would mean God did answer prayer, which would mean that he is guilty of misleading the people. So there's no mention of God. The blame for the incident sits squarely with Elijah. And Jezebel sends out a message saying she'll kill Elijah by the end of the day. And looking at the character of Jezebel, if you see it out in the Bible, she seems to have a lot in common with the Queen of Hearts. Off with their heads! And Elijah was just undoubtedly the latest in a long line of people getting in her way. And human life seems to mean very, very little to her. She made a very real threat, every intention and the means of carrying it out. After his great victory, Elijah was expecting a different reaction. He was expecting revival. He was expecting a great turning of all the people and the king and queen back to God. After all, had God just proved without a shadow of a doubt that he was real. And he answered the prayers of his prophet. Instead of repentance, though, he gets a death threat. And I think this is the straw that broke the camel's back. After 3 years of hiding and drought, he gave the last of himself on that mountain. Now he feels empty, disappointed, alone. There's something so human about that reaction. I love that the Bible includes this kind of information. The day after the greatest triumph, the sometimes feels strangely hollow. Modern day example of that, Lewis Hamilton, when he won his first world championship. He said, I woke up the next day and thought, isn't that it? You spend your whole life chasing this one thing, and when you get it, there's a strange emptiness. Or during to football, USA Mourinho, after winning the Champions League trophy, he said, the night was unforgettable, but the next morning I felt an emptiness. Because once you've reached the top, where else is there to go? And if you like music, well, you probably won't like Adele. But if you like music, Adele said after the success of 21, I should have been on top of the world, but I felt anxious and low. Success doesn't protect you from yourself. I think this helps put Elijah's fear into perspective. This was his greatest moment, and the world continued to on. He didn't see the change he expected. He wasn't weak, but he was human, exhausted, disappointed, and convinced that he was alone. So Elijah reacts the way most of us do when we get to overwhelm. He can't cope anymore. He isolates himself. In verse 3, he leaves his servant in Judah, and he carries on walking alone into the wilderness for a day's journey. I think I might have a slide for that, but I'm not sure. There we go. There's the whole bit there. Can't remember what slides I put together, and Joe Besser can't see them either. So he leaves his servant in Judah, and he carries on walking alone into the wilderness for a day's journey. And he collapses under a bush and prays to die. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. One moment he's running away because his life is threatened, and the next day he's praying to die. Makes sense of that? We're certainly weird as human beings, aren't we? He knows that God is present, and he doesn't play the fine games with God. He just tells him how it is. He speaks out of exhaustion, and it's real, and it's honest, and it's raw. But I think it's the second part of Elijah's prayer here that gives us a real insight into what's going on in his head. I know better than my ancestors. There's a weight of expectation pressing down on him. He's measuring himself against the stories he grew up with. The stories of Moses, the stories of Samuel. They led people to repentance. They challenged kings, and they kept them in line. And in his own estimation, he's failed to do either thing. How often do we do that? Measure ourselves against somebody else. Maybe we measure ourselves against great Christians of the past. Or maybe we measure ourselves against people sitting in this room. A couple of weeks ago, we did a Wednesday night Connect Plus privilege of meeting this Wednesday at 6:45 to 7 o'clock. Boom. Got it in. A couple of weeks ago, we did a night group. Some of our friends who are new in the faith apologize for not knowing the Bible very well. Because some of us can quote chapter and verse for some of the Bible. But at the same time, some of us were listening to their stories and thinking, I wish I still had that. I wish I still had that fire and those fresh discoveries of faith. Wish we could see something new in Scripture every time I open the book. And then there's the life outside those walls. We compare ourselves to so much. We scroll through social media, news on Instagram or Facebook, and you see all these people on wonderful holidays, or they're having romantic meals, or they're doing all these lovely things. Whoa. And you think, why can't I be like that? Why isn't my life like that? Why doesn't my family all love each other like that? But here's the truth. Moses and Samuel, they both had faith, but they also had some huge failures as well. But he's forgotten those. And those are perfect moments on social media. They're just that. They're moments. Nobody curates content to put their family arguments or the brutality of their life onto social media. God never asked us to be Moses or Samuel. And he doesn't ask you to be anyone else either. He meets you right where you are. And he calls you to be faithful in your story. Now, perhaps for you, it's not just burnout. like Elijah. Maybe it's something deeper. Maybe it's something a little bit heavier. Maybe it's for the name. Maybe it's for the diagnosis. Now, I'm not a doctor. Okay? I'm not. And sometimes it is a mental health condition, and sometimes you do need to go and speak to a doctor and get their advice, maybe take medication. But sometimes it's just a bit. But we still worry, whatever it is. How can I call myself a Christian and struggle with anxiety? How can I have depression when I've got the love of God? I've been in churches that are shying away from these things and they don't talk about them. People who struggle have been given platitudes or told they should have the joy of the Lord when their heart is just in their feet all the time. Did you know that some of the most revered Christians of the last few hundred years have suffered with mental health conditions? If I say to Phil, Prince of Preachers, who are we talking about, Phil? It's Spurgeon. Spurgeon, known as the Prince of Preachers. He documented Great Depression and fainting fits, yet he was meant to be one of the best preachers for the last couple of hundred years. John Bunyan describes his mental health as being in the iron cage of despair. C.S. Lewis wrote about it after his wife died in A Grief Observed. Martin Luther King, Rick Warren, Kurt Franklin, and a whole load of people that we don't know who sit in our churches week in, week out, struggle with life. Faith doesn't make us immune to it, but it does mean we have a God who meets us in them. And he meets Elijah under the broom tree. I think we've got the next slide if you go on to now. No, we've done that one. That's the one we want. So first step, and I'm calling this a 5-step plan of restoration, and it's just literally taken from this passage, and it's not going to work for everybody every time. God does different things at different times, but for this time, this is a 5-step plan for restoration. And the first thing is rest. He's exhausted, he's overwhelmed, he's upset, he's disappointed, and this is where God decides to meet him, in the collapse. And we'll do a tree in the wilderness. At this moment, we see God start a tender work of restoration. He doesn't preach at him. He doesn't correct him. At this point, God knows what Elijah really needs is a good sleep. So for Elijah, the first step is rest. And sometimes our life doesn't give us time to rest. So many things chasing us. We always have to be on the go. There's always work to be done, kids to go somewhere, this to do, that to do, phones to look at, because that is one of the biggest things that steals our rest, is scrolling through our phones all the time. We don't need for a life that's on our constant go. There was a pattern established in the first week of creation, day and night. It was woven into the most fabric of space and time. Day for activity, night for rest. And then 6 days of working, fulfilling our needs, and 1 day of rest to worship God. It's a model rhythm established by God in Genesis. It's reinforced in Exodus through the Ten Commandments. Then the Sabbath rest becomes part of the covenant law. Then jumping ahead into the New Testament. So, okay, we're not under the Ten Commandments anymore, but do we still have to rest? Well, Jesus called all those who are weary, I think we've got that one yet, come unto me and rest. And Hebrews 4 tells us that the Sabbath rest wasn't just about a day. It was pointing to something greater. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Would you like to see what rest looks like? That's the best. This is a very famous photo by a photographer called Anne Guess, and it's taken in 1993. And this baby was born prematurely at 28 weeks and weighed less than 2 pounds when she was born. This was her getting, just before she left the hospital, they were allowed to take this photo. It's the first time she'd actually been disconnected from all the machinery. But the baby, she isn't striving, she's not performing, she's not trying to earn anything from anyone. She's content, she's secure. At this point, she knows nothing but trust in those hands that are holding her. This is the rest of knowing we're securely held. Because the first step in restoration is rest. And maybe that's all you need to take from this passage. Maybe you can check out now. I hope you don't. But maybe that's what you need to take from this. To permission to stop, to breathe, or to rest. Because rest isn't weakness. It's worship. So we can carry on to the second half of verse 5 and 6. I think I've got this as a slide. An angel wakes Elijah up. He seems to blearily rub his eyes and look around, and there by his head is some bread that had been baked over hot coals and a jar of water. Elijah eats, he drinks, and he goes back to sleep. And this brings so many questions to my mind. How many people see angels in the Bible and they just go, oh, something like that? Maybe Elijah saw them all the time. I don't know. But he's not fussed about them at all. But the detail that blows my mind here, or as my wife would say, baffles my brain, is the fact that the cake or the bread had been baked in the hot coals. Just a few words change this whole thing. God could have provided a load of focus. He could have provided manna from heaven. But no, we have this rich, intimate, personal detail. The angel had been there for a while before Elijah woke up. Long enough to prepare a fire, create the loaf, and bake it. It's a personal provision, not just a generic supply. God's not going to do a half-baked job in restoration. I wasn't punning on that. He's going to take his time as he helps Elijah renourish his body. So Elijah goes back to sleep again, and then he gets woken up again, and then there's the first hint of a future plan. Gets up and eats, but the journey's too much for you. God is gently encouraging Elijah to renourish. God is our creator. He knows our physical needs. And you know, it's really hard to help somebody if their basic needs are not being met. Now, somebody who's more intelligent than me has made pyramid all the needs that need to be met to our guy called Maslow, there we go. Sorry? The hierarchy of needs, yeah. So basically, if the physical needs aren't being met, if sleep, food and water, the most basic needs aren't being met, then there's no point in trying to do anything else. Needs to meet those basic needs first. And God is doing exactly that right now. God's all about restoration with Elijah. He isn't giving him a toolkit. He isn't giving him a load of strategies that he can use to deal with stress. He's meeting his needs right there, right where he is, underneath the bush in the wilderness. God's not just providing bread and water, but in making the bread, God's offering his presence. We can depend on God to meet our needs. And being renourished is not weakness. It's worship. Elijah's rested, and after a second dose of calves, don't think I didn't notice it is calves that God makes here. He's been nourished, and it's time for him to be called apart from one into retreat. We can move on to the next slide. So strengthened by the food, Elijah sets off. We're not told that God calls him specifically to work. He's decided to go. Maybe it was Elijah's choice, maybe it was God's. But one thing is clear, Elijah knows he needs more than just sleep and bread. He needs God. So he walks. And this isn't just a little journey, it's a pilgrimage. It's 260 miles from Beersheba to Horeb. It was about 6.5 miles a day over 40 days. And remember, after doing this, what is fasting? So he's not eating anything, he's not drinking anything. So it's quite slow, actually, quite pedestrian for somebody who's out on a chariot in over 17 miles. But this isn't about speed, it's about his toll. And in this walk, I think there's a lot of processing going on. And I wonder what those 40 days actually felt like for Elijah. I mean, was he muttering as he went on? Was he just in silence alone with his thoughts? Did he pray? Did he shout at God and ask him what on earth he's doing and why is it so unfair? Did he rehearse his failures, his fears and his frustrations? We'll never know. That's a very detailed Bible doesn't give us. Why pick Horeb? Well, remember what Elijah said under the broom tree. I'm no better than my ancestors. That's not just exhaustion, that's comparison. It's disappointment. It's what I'm terming legacy anxiety. So maybe he goes to the place where one of his heroes met God. It's not immediately clear from the text, but when it's called Horeb, we don't always associate it that is actually Mount Sinai, the same place where Moses saw fire and cloud, where the law was given, where God passed by. So maybe Elijah is saying, if I'm no less from Moses, maybe I can at least find the God of Moses there. Maybe he's hoping that if he stands where Moses stood, he'll hear what Moses heard. What if you do this? Try and find a place where you can meet them. We take flies, or we go for a long walk, or we sit in the garden and ask God, where are you? Maybe it's part of your morning routine. Maybe before you start your day, you like to meet with God. Jesus certainly did this, and there are obviously similarities between what Elijah's doing here and what Jesus would later do when, after his baptism, after a big public spectacle, he went into the wilderness for 40 days. Both are 40-day periods, both are fasting, and both are being tested about their identity. But more than this, Jesus had a habitual pattern of meeting with God, of getting up early to pray. This was his rhythm, and maybe it is something that we can learn from. The importance of the retreat to fuel us for our day ahead. Now, when I was growing up, I had this model to me. My dad used to work as a delivery driver. He used to work for Mother's Ride when they used to be just down the road here, and later he worked for Rogers, which meant he used to start his day ridiculously early, like 3 o'clock in the morning. And as a child, I remember sometimes waking up in the night, knowing that the light was on, because I could see the light from the kitchen around my bedroom door. And I'd go to the kitchen to get something, knowing full well my dad was there preparing for his day. The kettle would go on for his morning cup of coffee and for the flask that he's going to take with him. And even though it'd be so easy for him to say at that time of the morning that he was tired or that he wasn't yet awake, he would sit down and he would read his Bible and he would pray before heading out the door to work. And he made this retreat, this time for himself to have time before the house was awake. Just to have time with him and God. Time which I undoubtedly ruined by getting up to share the leftover sweet coffee from his coffee jar. But retreat isn't weakness, it's worship. So Elijah's rested, he's renourished, and he's headed for a retreat. And so far, God has proved his presence and his care, but he hasn't spoken a single word. He doesn't appear to be in a great rush to do that. When Elijah arrives at Mount Horeb, he finds a cave, and God lets him sleep again. God's not rushing this. Elijah's walked and climbed for 40 days. God knows that he's still exhausted, and Elijah needs to be ready when God is ready to speak. So for Elijah, this cave is a sanctuary, a place of silence, a calm before the storm. I was thinking about it. I will never know about this really, but it's like when the headmaster or the headmistress makes you sit outside that office when they called you in for something. You kind of sat there and left it to stew and wait to see what they want. As I said, I wouldn't have known about that, but which never happens. And then when God does something, what does he say? He literally just asks a question. What are you doing here, Elijah? God's inviting Elijah to reflect. It's not telling off. God knows Elijah better than Elijah knows himself. He could tell him exactly what he's thinking and exactly why he's wrong. But he doesn't. He invites Elijah to offload, to speak, to be heard. This question from God is an invitation into intimacy. It's not an interrogation. There's no instruction. It's just the invitation to share his innermost feelings. Do you feel like you can share your innermost feelings with God? Hard, isn't it? But the question that God asks in the test is not trying to make him shameable. He's just trying to allow it to be heard. And Elijah doesn't do what we do. He doesn't say, no, I'm fine. And we don't have to be pouring out our hearts to every single person that we meet in church on a Sunday morning. Okay? I'm not asking you to do that. But sometimes we just need to be honest. Sometimes things aren't fair so well. It's always good to have a few friends around you that you can actually just tell the truth. More importantly, people who can tell the truth back to you. They can give you empathetic love, support, encouragement, and challenge. And our restoration can only begin when we stop pretending and we're honest before God. Now, men and women deal with this kind of stuff a little bit differently. If you go to Bess and you tell her what's going on, she will empathize with you. She will listen to you. She'll walk that emotional journey with you. Come to me. Well, from the moment you start talking, I'll be trying to work out how I can fix it. Because that's the way I'm wired. But God doesn't do that. He doesn't try and fix Elijah. He listens, he invites, and he makes space for him to speak. Because restoration isn't about answers, it's about that intimacy with God. And then Elijah responds, he pours his heart out to God. I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant. They've torn down your altars and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. Well, we know some of this is factually incorrect. If we read about it in the passage, then we know there's other prophets. We know that people who were on the mountaintop worshipped God. So Elijah's got a bit of a skewed perspective here. But Elijah's being governed by his feelings. Feelings are legitimate, but they're not always worth being guided by, and they're not always true. God tells Elijah to go and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord. We've seen real intimacy in this whole journey. The personal presence of the angel, the invitation to share the hardship of experience, and now Elijah's invited into the presence of God. Now, if I were reading this like a piece of fiction for a literature to say, I'd see this next section as very symbolic. There are three great and mighty events, and each one is amazing and awesome in its own right. There's a great and powerful wind which is strong enough to split the mountain and shatter rocks. This would represent Elijah's thoughts, scattered, broken, swirling. The chaos of burnout and the storm of unmet expectations. Then there's the earthquake. The ground shakes. Everything is unstable, just like Elijah's own identity after his comparison with his ancestors and feeling like he doesn't measure up. And then the fire. Just a month before, Elijah had called down fire from heaven. The fire is a memory of a past glory, a moment he'll never be able to beat or recreate in his career. But this fire, unlike the last time, God is near. God's not in any of these signs. Elijah comes to the mountain of Moses, the place of thunder and commands of war and wonder. And God chooses to speak to him the way he spoke to Samuel in Shiloh, in the quiet, in the dark, with a whisper. Elijah doesn't need more fire, just done that. He doesn't need to be more shaken. His soul is shaken enough already. He doesn't need more noise. He needs the presence of God in the whisper. So as this is all settling into Elijah's soul, God's question comes again. What are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah, having reflected after everything he's experienced over the last month and the last 3.5 years and the last hour, his response is exactly the same. Elijah's still processing. He's still reflecting. He hasn't changed how he feels yet. But reflection is how we return to God. It's how we realign ourselves to God's way. It's how we remember. And it isn't always something like that. Reflection isn't weakness. It's worship. And even while this processing is still going on, God moves to the last step of his intensive fire step. Seems like Elijah handed in his resignation when he collapsed under the broom tree in the wilderness. God hasn't told Elijah not to be so silly. He hasn't thrown him into a home of burned out prophets or sidelined him. Instead, he's begun the process of restoration and he recommissions him. So he says, go back to the way you came. And then he restores Elijah's purpose. It's as if he's saying, Elijah, your story isn't over. You still have a role to play. You still have something to do. And isn't that what we all need? To know that we matter? To know that we make a difference? Elijah had waited 3.5 years for that mountaintop moment. But the next day it felt like nothing had changed. And he was lost. Proverbs 29:18 says, where there is no vision, the people perish. So God gives Elijah a new vision. Is to anoint Hazael and Jehu as kings. The politics are going to shift, and Ahab's time is limited. God has a bigger plan when it starts with Elijah. Then Elijah's perspective is reframed. He said, I'm the only one left. But God says there are 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. Elijah not get Baal compared to Moses and Samuel, but God doesn't ask him to be Moses or Samuel. He gives him a new mission. But like Moses, he'll confront idolatry. Like Samuel, he'll anoint kings. But this is Elijah's legacy. No more legacy anxiety, just legacy purpose. And then lastly, Elijah has a partnership ordained. If you can click the next slide, please. Thank you. Elijah's called to anoint Elisha, not just a successor, but a companion, a friend to walk the road with, a mentor, partnership. Because restoration doesn't end in solitude, it ends in community. Elijah's story isn't over, neither is yours. Elijah thought it was all finished, but God recommissions him, not with shame, but with purpose. Because recommission isn't just a task, it's trust. And trust, like rest, renourishing, retreat, and reflection, is worship. So on that mountaintop, Elijah challenged the people. How long will you waver between the two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. God answered with fire, the people believed. As we've seen, that's not the only way God speaks. Sometimes he speaks not in fire, but in dread. Not in thunder, but in silence. Not in spectacle, but in a whisper. Jesus says in Revelation 3:20, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with them, and they with me. Through his broken body and his blood poured out, Jesus invites us to sit at his table. Not just for a moment of strength, but for eternal life. Maybe say you feel like Elijah. Maybe you feel overwhelmed and burnt out and disappointed. And maybe you're in a cave. Maybe you're silent and you're waiting and unsure if God will ever speak. The good news is this. Jesus is knocking. Not with thunder, not with fire, but with a whisper. And he says, let me in. Let me feed you. Let me restore you. And you let Jesus in, it isn't a miraculous solution. There's a promise in the Bible that we don't like very much because it says in this world you'll have trouble. That's a promise from Jesus. It also says, take heart, for I have overcome the world. So you don't get a life free of trouble if you believe in Jesus, but you do get a life filled with presence. You don't get immunity from pain, but you get intimacy with the one who walks through it with you. You don't get empty promises, but you do get adoption into God's family, healed by the blood of Jesus. So, if you don't know him, this is your moment to stop running, to stop hiding, to stop carrying the burden alone, and open the door to the one who's been knocking for all along.